Broadcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Rene, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate this. I think when we were talking ahead of this starting, I'd mentioned what I loved about your book, or love about your book, is you've really taken a couple different approaches in a number of the books that I've read in regards to influence, either introducing some new concepts, not new, but new to, I think, what you generally find in influencing books, but also expanding on some ones that we've probably all heard about that are in this space. And I'd love to be able to touch on a few of those if we can.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure being here. Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah. One of the things that I immediately thought of when I was reading this in the very beginning was you talk about the importance of understanding resistance. Again, not something that I think that we tend to talk about in terms of influence books. We're always about how do you get people to yes. But I do think for leaders, for anybody that's trying to influence somebody, I feel like our normal thing is to resist first.
Yeah, I think it's when we think about the way we're structured and the way your brain is structured. And that's the one thing we have in common is how our brain works. And so since the brain is the one thing we have in common, we have to understand sort of the sequence of how it works. And our brains aren't designed to make you happy. They're not designed to make you successful. They're not designed for any of that stuff. They're designed to keep you alive for survival. And the more negative we've been over the years, meaning prone to seeing negativity, they call it negativity bias, the longer we survive. You know, you walk out in the woods and you're in unfamiliar territory and you hear a crack in the woods, you look and you're scared, which means you're assuming something potentially threatening is there immediately before you have any logical sense or any knowledge or information. Your first assumption is danger. And so that translates into how we view the media and how the media treats us, social media, and that sort of proneness to being negative. But it's also the initial resistance to ideas because we want to keep homeostasis, which is the process of basically balance. And change or new ideas or innovation requires an imbalance of the homeostasis in the state that we were in. Even if homeostasis physically, mentally, and emotionally was a place that wasn't good for us, it's familiar. And so we'll protect that at all costs. And so when it comes to selling, persuasion, influence, change, any of that stuff, we have to deal with that biology first.
And along those lines, right? If I'm a leader, if I'm a manager trying to get people to go in my direction, if I've created an environment that's threatening, that's activates that RAS system the wrong way, what's the downside?
Well, when you're talking about the RAS or the reticular activating system, that's the system that determines what we pay attention to. What we're trying to not trigger is the amygdala, which is sort of the part of the brain that is the alert system. It's the radar to potential threats. And we were prone to create physical safety, but now in a more modern world, it's around psychological safety. Am I going to be embarrassed? Are you going to take my job? Are you going to threaten my money and my income, my security? Am I going to look foolish? Am I going to get yelled at? You know, there's all sorts of potential psychological threats that we respond the same way we would to a physical threat. And so when it comes to the communication, we have to protect psychological safety in the same way that we would protect physical safety, structure, order, predictability. And so if I approach you physically and I start attacking you, you're going to lock up and attack back. So if I approach you and attack you verbally or even underhandedly or passive aggressively, my brain is going to respond in a like manner, but maybe an emotional attack or a lock up and freeze or run away from the situation or just not pay attention. And so there's all sorts of ways that we look at that sort of that parallel physical and psychological safety component.
Yeah. It's like our brain doesn't know the difference between somebody attacking me physically or somebody saying something that offends me or embarrasses me. The system acts the same way and overacts, right? So often now.
And the reason it doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional is because the trigger of that is stress. And so that common denominator of stress, if I'm being chased by a bear in the woods, I'll reach that level 10 stress of survival. But if I say I have a fear of public speaking and I'm in a room full of critiquing individuals, that same stress level will be high, but not triggered by a physical threat, but more of an emotional, psychological threat. And so that one common denominator is understanding the stress response.
Yeah. It's interesting. There was a book that I read a number of years ago. It was called How Children Succeed. And it talked about allostasis and the allostatic load that we all have. And similar to what you're talking about is that when this system gets activated, it was for fight, flight, or freeze. And that in today's environment, that same system triggers more often than it needs to. But if that's happening all the time, right? If I'm leading a group and I've created an environment where there's stress and I'm leading people in a way that's not positive, I'm really working against myself in terms of influencing, right? The message can't get there.
Oh, 100%. And the idea of creating a safe, engaging culture is not new. It's been around. I've been doing this work for close to 30 years, and that's what we were talking about 30 years ago. It's still the challenge. And you'll see a new leader will operate from the assumption of you work here, therefore you do as you're told. Because maybe they operated that way, right? I know I operate that way. I'm a very obedient person when it comes to somebody that I believe in. If I believe in you and you're my leader, I'm going to do as I'm told, right? Respect authority. And usually that bodes pretty well because I'll work hard in that pursuit. But not everybody has the same entitlement, and not everybody has that same sort of outlook. And so you have to be able to lead through a very different manner, through influence, which would be interpersonal, not through authority. And so creating a culture or an environment that's safe, psychologically safe, starts with how do you do, and here, I guess, let me back up. How do you know if it's psychologically safe? And how do you know a good culture? I think the one measure is, can I speak the truth, the difficult truth, to my leader? If I can speak a difficult truth without fear of repercussion, without fear of job loss, without fear of hurting my career, that is a very good, I'd say, high-performing environment. If I fear truth, meaning if I fear any sort of repercussion to speaking the truth, I mean, a disagreement, a different path, or something that maybe I think might go wrong, or just I don't like it. And if I have to hold that back, I'm holding back the value that I was hired to bring. And now what it creates is what I call la-la land for the leader, that they think all their ideas are great.
Yeah.
And that's where I say that la-la land is where disengaged or disconnected leaders go to die.
In the environment that we're in, though, if you think about the Great Resignation or quiet quitting, all these things that are going on, to me, it would suggest that most leaders don't create that environment. So how do you change that? How do you go into that organization?
Well, so I wrote an article for Chief Executive Magazine on what I believe to be the underlying cause of the Great Resignation. And so you go back to 50 years ago, most people died very close to where they worked, to where they lived. We lived in tight-knit, close communities. I saw my boss every single day. I knew the nuances. I knew their facial expressions. I knew the tone of voice and what it meant of my coworkers as well. And if I went to the grocery store, I probably saw my coworkers and my boss there. If I went to the barber, they were probably there. If I went to church, I saw them all there. If my coach, I went to baseball for my kids, my boss might have been the coach of my kids' baseball team. So these tight-knit communities. So then we started advancing in technology, advancing in transportation, and advancing in communications. And those three advancements started allowing us to willingly start moving further and further away from these tight-knit communities. But the funny part is we did it with a consoling illusion. And that consoling illusion, I say consoling, and I stress illusion, that we still knew each other. So I could get back and forth easily. So that makes it easier. And I can look at my CRM or my ERP and go, I can see when they logged in and I can see the metrics. So I know what they're doing. But yet we didn't have the interpersonal interactions like we used to. Then on top of that, you get a pandemic. And a pandemic then pulls us further apart. And we go through a values reconstruction, a values reprioritization as a society. And we want more meaning and more connection at work. And we're getting none of it. And now this is where the poor leader is exposed. The ones that weren't connected, the ones that didn't know their people, the ones that didn't make a good culture and didn't communicate and assumed that, hey, you're at work and you're assumed to do their job. We click in on Zoom and we're all good. And there's a gap between that narrative, because of that narrative between understanding who you are, and then a recruiter comes along and paints this beautiful picture of possibility somewhere else. Gives me the feeling of possible connection again. They take interest in what it is that I'm doing. They listen to what's going on. And all of a sudden, it's like, I'm not as happy as I was here. And 76% of people were leaving because they lacked the abilities to listen, empathize, and be compassionate about what's going on.
I think too about that though. And I wonder, if we were to go back 50 years is in terms of not having social media out there where I could say, if I'm in Maine and I've got a bad boss and this is the environment I'm in, I don't have much perspective to gauge it off of, right? I've only got my area. Whereas now if I know, the type of treatment somebody gets in California or Phoenix or wherever that is, I'm seeing, wow, not everybody gets treated this way.
I think you're 100% right. That gap in the narrative is filled in. And so let's talk about narrative gap, because I think that's at the core of all of this. If you think about that feeling you just had when I paused just now, right?
Yeah.
Did you feel a cold chill go down your spine and think of what's going on? So here I am. We're all in a narrative. And narratives are what we call constructs of reality. So if you're listening to this, you probably heard a pause there. That was me freezing. And if you're watching this, I look like maybe I was frozen. Your brain doesn't do well in those gaps when there's a gap in our narrative. And since narratives are constructs of reality, what does your brain do? Immediately fills it. And if we don't know what to fill it with, emotions come with it, and our negativity bias comes in, and we probably assume the worst. And so here, let me ask you a question. What did you think happened when I froze? Bandwidth, right? So then your brain didn't allow saying, I'll wait to see what happened. It immediately filled the gap. Immediately. And it filled it with past experiences. You've done tons of these podcasts. You know that bandwidth can be an issue. So you pulled from your past experience, which would be what I call the source of the gap of the narrative. And so you pulled from your past experience to ensure a clear understanding of what your reality is. And so now what's interesting is that it was incorrect. I did it on purpose, right? Now, those that know me will pull from their past experience of me to go, oh, Rene's doing one of his things again. Right. And so now what happens when the boss isn't around? And I'll give you an example. Let's say there's a meeting and the boss doesn't show up, CEO doesn't show up. One person says, Patrick didn't show up again. Oh, he's up probably getting another yacht. I don't know how many yachts he needs. Same meeting, somebody else goes, oh, Patrick didn't show up. Hold on a second. Something must be wrong. Let me check on him, see if he's okay. Same situation. CEO doesn't show up. One person goes to greed and a yacht. The other person goes to compassion and care. Why? Isn't reality supposed to be the same for all of us? And we clearly know it's not. So then the weird thought is we live alternate realities, which is crazy. And then we go, okay, why did one person choose greed and yacht? Why did the other choose compassion and empathy? Well, the reason is they had different sources. One person didn't have a connection with the leader, so they were forced to pull from their personal experience, which is a crapshoot. You may have had great experiences with leaders in the past, or you may have negative ones. This person must have had very greedy leaders in the past. And so they pulled from that. The other person pulled from the personal relationship as the source of the narrative gap. And they pulled from that because probably they knew their story. And this is why we stress leaders need to share their story, because the story becomes the brand, and the brand shows up to meetings way before the leader ever shows up. And it remains long after to answer those questions, to fill in the gaps, if you will, in the narrative of the relationship.
Yeah. When I'm hearing you tell that story, I think of some of the accounts, some of the hospitals, especially that I've worked, where there were some challenges. And oftentimes it was, if a resource was not available to a group or if things were being reduced, it went to the hospital only cares about money. That was the narrative, right? That gets filled in. Yeah. And I think oftentimes because there was a lack of communication in terms of the why behind the decision being made. And I was reading through your book, you talk about tie downs, and I'm wondering, does that fit there in terms of the tie down is really about explaining the reason why something's being done, right? You put something out there, but then say, this is why it's being done. Or I don't know if that makes sense.
A tie down's a little bit different. A tie down is around what my message means to you, what the value of it is. And so now they are sort of closely related, because it's the tie down is what ensures the meaning of the message. And without a tie down, the other person might create one through a false narrative gap fill from a source that isn't correct, right? And so if you're looking at that, a situation like that, to me, it's always clear to have that third step, because we're referring to the Amplify formula, frame, message, tie down. We create a frame to frame the message, which really frame up the meaning of the message, and the tie down is to ensure that we know what it means to you or what we need you to do with this information. That sequence is there. And without the tie down, you're left to the devices of the listener to assume and to make their own connection of what they think it means. To me, that is a risk on every aspect, because for me to hopefully they get it, and we assume people get exactly what our meaning and intent is, and that's just not the case. Communication is hard, and we have to be very explicit about the intent and the outcome that we're looking for.
Yeah, I do see that, where we generally don't think of, we're reducing people and that's a benefit. We go to the negative, right? That this is not a good thing that happens. And I wonder if that goes back to our amygdala as well. It's protecting us. It's saying this is a threat somehow.
Well, that's the negativity bias. So negativity bias is, if you think, go back to the caveman days, right? Cavemen didn't wake up in the middle of wake up in the morning, stretch and go, oh, wow, look at how beautiful the sky is. And like, man, my family's sleeping good. I'm going to go forage some food today and harvest some meat. Yeah, they're not going to do that. They're going to wake up and, immediately on the defense. And they're going to look at families. Okay, are there any threats around? They're immediately going to look for the negative. If there's a twig that breaks in the grass, they're going to look around corners. All of that stuff is around negativity. And by being that way, it doesn't mean they're negative. It means that they're smart and they survive longer because they're looking for it. Now, the overuse of that in a safe environment, physically safe environment, you can trigger that DNA process, that negativity bias that's ingrained in us for our survival through a media headline, a news headline, breaking news. What is it? And then if you leave that up to a lack of communication from a leader, they're going to fill it in. And if they don't know the leader, if they don't have a relationship with them, they're going to fill it with their own past experience. And we don't know what that is.
Yeah. You talk about self-awareness or emotional intelligence, I should say. How important is that as we talk about leadership? How important is emotional intelligence? And I'll give you a story in a minute, my own experience with that.
Well, we know, I think it was 1995, and my mother received probably 15 packages in the mail, and it was all about the Time magazine cover of when it was, what's your EQ? It said, okay, IQ will get you hired, but EQ will get you promoted. And it was the first time that the work from Peter Salovey came out on the concept of emotional intelligence. And what it showed was that we used to think there was a correlation between your intellect and your income and success in life. And they found that there is no correlation. There's a lot of really smart, broke people out there. Right? Exactly. Thank God for us. And the research actually showed the C students were the ones that became the CEOs, and they hired the A students. I got a friend of mine, Brad Lee, that says, I've got 2 PhDs, I got an engineering degree and 3 MBAs, and they all work for me. I never finished high school, but he runs 7 businesses, right? And it's because the intelligence is different. There's different forms of that. But what we're talking about in leadership, emotional intelligence is broken down to 3 things. One is around self-awareness. It's the first cornerstone of it. Do I understand how I'm coming across? Do I even know how I feel? Am I self-aware to know how my actions are affecting other people? The second one is empathy. How is my current state affecting someone else? Can I be smart enough and self-aware enough to know how I'm being affected and how I might be affecting someone else? And the third part is a discipline and the tool set to be able to change how I'm behaving, acting, feeling, speaking, tone to best suit the situation for the desired outcome. And so those 3 components, a leader that doesn't have that is disastrous.
Yeah.
They're tone deaf. They're a bull in a china shop. They might get short-term results, but they won't inspire.
Yeah. It's interesting. So back in 2008, when I left the pharmaceutical industry and went out and started my own business around coaching and leadership development and sales, I had gone through a coaching program, but as part of that, there was also an opportunity to get trained and licensed in emotional intelligence, specifically this group, Genos Emotional Intelligence out of Australia. And I was reading through what emotional intelligence was, and I thought, this is a sales script. That's all this is understanding your environment. I've been doing this for 15 years. But Absolutely. What's interesting is that after I finished all of this, I was invited back to a very large pharmaceutical company that I used to work for to do some training for them. Went in to meet with their director of sales. And the director of sales says, I will talk to you about coming in here to do training on anything but that emotional intelligence. I thought, I can't believe this is an environment that sells science, and they just totally missed the boat on this.
How long ago was that?
So this was 2009.
2009. Okay. So imagine talking about this stuff in 95.
Yeah.
Like that's when we started doing this. And people talk about, like, we call them the soft skills back and the soft side. It's like, those are the things that determine the outcomes of things. The hard skills are easy. You can hire those, but somebody that understands people and can rally troops around it and mobilize people to take action, it's not a logical process to get somebody to work extra hours. And right now they're measuring it finally in what they call employee engagement, which would be the use of discretionary effort and time and thought. Like, I have discretionary time as I come to work for you, meaning I come to work for you 9 to 5. But there's lunchtime. What am I doing over lunch, over my breaks? What am I doing at home? What am I thinking about in my head? That's discretionary. You can't control what I think about. You can't control my time outside of work. But a highly engaged employee is thinking about creative ideas and solutions all the time. Even when they're at home, they might wake up in the middle of the night and think of something and write it down. They might get up early and work on themselves so they can bring more to work. That's a highly engaged person. And what they found were there was only 16% of people were highly engaged at one point. Now, those numbers change all the time. I don't know what they are currently, but those that have that, the emotionally intelligent leader is the one that's able to engage people at a much deeper level.
When I talk about in terms of leadership, right, it's the difference between having people that follow you and those that want to follow you, right? The wanting is the engagement part, is that I'm going to do this because I want to, not because I'm afraid that if I don't, I'm not getting a paycheck or I'm getting fired, whatever is going to happen. I want to go where you're asking me to go.
Yeah, I might even add to that and say, do you have people that follow you or do you have people that obey you?
Yeah.
And if I think one of the scariest things is for an organization to have a group of obedient people, because when someone's obedient, they'll do as they're told, but they won't think.
Yeah.
And I remember a story of one of the leaders that we work with. They just took over a $5 billion organization, and he literally just took over. They had fired the entire board. It was a class action lawsuit. So we used to get called in to train organizations like this. He just gets called at 9:30 at night, kind of going through getting familiar with the business, gets a call from one of the facilities, and I don't know where it was. He says, "Hey, this is John over in such and such a city. Joe didn't show up again today." And this is the CEO getting this phone call from a mill. He goes, "What do you think I should do?" He goes, "Well, what do you think you should do?" He goes, "Well, I think I should fire him." He goes, "Well, fire him." And he hangs up the phone. He's thinking, and he saw this over and over and over again. What they had was an extremely obedient organization. And the previous leadership, they would do is they jump in their jets, they'd fly around 4 places a day, and they'd walk around and tell people, "Oh, turn this knob, do this, get rid of that, do this, and that." And people would realize that they didn't have the leeway to actually, or empowerment to make a decision, because someone was going to make it for them. So they became extremely obedient, and which means if they weren't told to do it, it wasn't happening.
Yeah.
But you have an engaged force, and they'll say, "Hey, you know what? I saw this happening. I went ahead and took care of it." And they were thinking creatively. They were engaged in what was going on. They're solving problems before they became issues. And they were foreseeing things. They were being innovative. They were offering solutions. That sense of engagement, obediency, is one of the scariest things for an organization.
It's interesting. I remember working for an organization, and one of the managers that I was working with, the group that was with him loved him. And this sticks out to me. One of the things he always said was that he would always tell employees, like, there's nothing that you can break that I probably can't have fixed by tomorrow morning, which was a great way for them to really not be afraid to think on their own and do things, because they knew that.
I love that.
Yeah. Isn't that great? To me,
that's worth repeating again, because I'm going to write that one down. There's nothing you can break that we can't have fixed by tomorrow morning.
That I can't fix by tomorrow morning. And he said, that alone, what that did to people is just that stress is gone, right? Is like, okay, I got this. My boss has got my back. So
I'm still writing that down. I think that's so powerful. Nothing you can break that we can't have fixed within 24 hours.
Yeah.
Tomorrow morning. I love that.
Yeah. Which leads me into, you talk about 4 steps to influence. And the first one is my safe. Again, not something I think people generally think about when they're thinking leadership and influence, but how important that is, right? It ties into me the whole idea of psychological safety, of creating an environment where I'm not able to really listen to what you're proposing if I don't feel safe.
Yeah. The 4 steps to influence, really comes, the inspiration behind that came from a theory called the triune-brain theory. It was developed, 60 some years ago by Dr. Paul MacLean. It's actually a debunked theory, but so it's literally inaccurate, but metaphorically extremely accurate. I work with a lot of neuroscientists, a lot of psychologists, and we all talk about how it's a debunked theory, but theoretically and metaphorically, it's a great way for people to understand how the brain works. And so the triune-brain theory, even though it's debunked, again, it's literally inaccurate, but metaphorically very accurate. Basically says that we have 3 different parts of the brain, and that the parts of the brain also work in a certain sequence. And so you have that first part, which is the basal ganglia, or what they call the reptilian brain or lizard brain. So now we don't have a lizard brain. It's not the way it functions. So don't take it literally. But if you think about it, we have a certain part of our brain that is very primitive in the way it behaves. And it's very territorial, doesn't think to the future. You might call it in what Daniel Kahneman made very famous in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, of System 1.
Yeah.
So it's reactive, and it doesn't think to the future. It's very fast to respond. And so it doesn't even have always cognitive awareness before it responds. So it could be responding to something, making a judgment, filling the gap before you're even consciously aware of it. You could be showing your emotional state for 5 seconds in your body before you're consciously even aware that you feel something. So there's all sorts of underlying processes that are happening constantly with us. And so a way around that is to create a sense of safety. And that's psychological and physical safety. In the boardroom, physical safety is assumed, right? But psychological safety is the hard part. Can I share an idea without being ridiculed? And so once you've done that, the way we do that is we remember 3 things: structure, order, and predictability. That comes through having a common language. That comes through statements and phrases like, hey, there's nothing you can break that we can't have fixed by tomorrow morning. So have at it. That's just a magical statement to create safety and empower me to be creative and to think, because now I know that my ideas, and what you do is you trigger inside of people something that is invaluable. You trigger their own self-actualization desire to be the best. Nobody wants to fail. And if you trigger that internal, that voluntary energy in people, you get things out of them that you would have never gotten. That's what we named our company after. Volentum stands for voluntary momentum. And so the second part is the limbic system. The limbic system is, they would call in that theory, the mammalian brain. And it starts having, mammalian characteristics. Like we bond when we're in that part of the brain. We're a little bit more evolved. And so we like relationships. There's emotion, values, and it's the gateway to long-term memory. That's why memory and emotions are so closely tied together. We remember where we were when 9/11 happened. And if you're old enough, you remember where we were when Kennedy was shot, the Space Shuttle Challenger blowing up. There's all sorts of things that were monumental, or we call light bulb memory moments. And so those are because they're so closely related. They're so emotional. They trigger our values, principles, and feelings that they ingrain themselves and then literally almost brand themselves in our brain. And our brain takes in all the information in that moment and creates a vivid mental picture. And so what we say is that part of the brain says, do you care? The first part of the brain is selfish. Am I safe? I care about you. Now as I evolve, I can think about you. I can think about us. Do you care about me? Do you value me? And if I can answer those first two questions, I open up access to the more human side of who we are, which would be called the neocortex. And that part of the brain needs to be engaged and stimulated. And so it's asking a different question. Am I engaged? Is this engaging or is this interesting? Because we're looking at data, we're looking at information. I'm going to argue with you. I'm going to be in the search for truth. I get a bigger version. And we're the only the species that has this sort of part of the brain. So we can problem solve. We can have language. We have the ability to write and read, math, all of the things that really we need to bring to work. But if we haven't answered the first two questions, safety and do you value me? We don't have access to it. So it's like strategic planning. Let's think to the future, which would be the fourth part. Is this inspiring? Now, for that to be inspired, I need to feel safe. I need to feel valued. I need to be engaged. Then I need to connect to my values. If I can connect to my values, all of a sudden you have my full capacity at work. Am I safe? Do you care? Is this interesting? And is this inspiring?
Yeah. Again, if it's debunked, I do think it provides a nice workflow there. And when I was reading that, I was thinking a lot of some work that was done by David Rock years ago, right? He has a model called SCARF, which is, if you're familiar with that model, but it's an acronym for 5 social needs that he identified that we all have. And this was back in 2009. And he talks about it in terms of reward versus avoidance, that when those aren't met, we tend to avoid the situation, we go away. And when they're satisfied, we move toward it. And I think in this environment, I will tell you, I've used this model for over 10 years, and I found it more relevant today than it was prior to COVID. And, when I was reading what you were talking about, I was thinking about in his SCARF model, the first one is status, right? About a feeling of value, of being respected. So it hits on your number 2 there of
valued.
Do I feel valued? But the first one around being safe hits around the C in his model, which is about certainty, that we need to have a sense of certainty in the environment that we're in. And then the next one talks about autonomy. The next one talks about relatedness or feeling connected. And the last one talks about fairness. And I will tell you, as I think about what you've talked about in your book and also just from a leadership perspective, I think when leaders, individuals are able to understand those 5 social needs and satisfy those, the message, what we're trying to do around influence, I think it just becomes so much easier for us. It's like we satisfy the basic human needs that we have.
I love that. I think so what a great checklist to ensure you're on track. Yeah, I love that.
So along those lines, though, as we sort of start to wrap things up here, how do you feel the pandemic has impacted either the way individuals need to lead today or how the messages are received? Do you see a greater challenge?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at one I mentioned before, the pandemic shifted our social values. We're looking for more connection, more meaning at work. And so people, if they don't have that, they're going to leave. So leaders need to prioritize the culture, the connection, the interactions between people, the teamwork. And now in a hybrid environment where people are working remotely, that's tough.
Yeah.
I mean, we have trained some of the biggest organizations in the world on how to create an engagement virtually. And I still do that. We work with people in Shanghai and Brussels and Belgium and Australia, in Mexico, in Argentina, groups that are just all over the world. And there are ways to do it. So leaders need to understand the hybrid world and how to create connection. It comes to literally things like camera placement. Audio is really important. If I don't have good audio right now, all of a sudden it's not as connected if we don't have that. And so the, lighting so we can see facial expressions, because these are the things that recreate the in-person experience. And so there's a whole hybrid virtual side of it. But then there's the piece of allowing people the ability to connect with the work. People have choices. Whether or not you agree with it or not is irrelevant. It's what people need right now.
Yeah.
If they have choices, then we need to be able to listen to that. And so I think it's shifted a ton because it's requiring, the bad times and times like this, they oust leaders. Because, one of the things that I've been saying is that we've moved away from the information age and we're in the age of attention. Right now, where billions of dollars are being spent to capture people's attention. Attention is it. And I might even add to that. I heard this said one time, this is also the age of reckoning, the reckoning of poor leaders, the leaders that didn't connect with their people. And if you didn't do the work prior, this is when you're exposed. And during the pandemic, when it first started, I wrote an article called The 10 Leadership Brands You Don't Want. And it talked about what I saw as sort of the 10 types of leaders that you don't want to be, the ones that show up after the battle. Like, it's like, well, how did it go? The battle's over. And we all know you weren't around. And so you've lost all credibility. Yeah. The tone deaf leader, the one that's like, hey, why are you working? And they're in their hot tub and they're sending photos to everybody. Well, not everybody has a couple $1 million in the bank. And some people still needed to work and figure out how to get by in that time period. And so the tone deaf nature of that, there's, the jokester and the one that's, telling jokes instead of leading. They know every meme and the Tiger King and all the stuff, but there's people needed leadership during that time. And I told them, I said, at the end of the pandemic, every leader is going to be judged. And at the end of the pandemic is the day of reckoning. Who were you during those difficult times? And so that, to me, was the exposure of who the good leaders were. And now the price to pay is the resignation, the great resignation.
It's interesting. And I'd be curious if you've heard any of these conversations of people saying, well, we have the great resignation right now or quiet quitting. But when the economy really goes poorly and people don't have the options that they have today, that's going to change again. And my belief on that is I don't think that's going to happen. I think what will happen is it will go underground again. That disengagement will simply go underground. And I think it'll be worse then because now people will resent the fact that when they had the opportunity to leave the company they're with, they didn't take it and now they're stuck.
There's always the argument of you got to be appreciative of the fact you have work. And I'm all for being appreciative of work and gratitude. I'm all for it. But that's not the simplistic answer to your point. It will go underground. There are basic human needs that go far beyond a paycheck, far beyond a paycheck. At the end of our life, we're going to have to ask ourselves and look in the mirror and say, what mark did I make on this world? Was a paycheck the only thing that I did? And the sooner people have that realization, the more they start questioning the work. So much work is done on the why of why we work, which I think is great. Simon Sinek brought that to the forefront. But there's a big missing piece. The how is the only time we're alive. And the how is how we're measured. How did I live my life? How did I live? Was I good in the process? Was I a good person? Was I engaging? Was I somebody that inspired, or did I cause fear? Or did I abuse? Was I a bully? Did I get it done at all costs? And so the how we achieve the result, to me, matters even more than the why. The why is your own personal reason for it. And if you're good at articulating it, you might engage others. But the how is who you are. It's the person that you are. It's the leader that you are. The end does not justify the means. Whatever you practice in your way to success, leadership, power, whatever it is the person that you will become, but amplified once you get into a position of power. You watch the Cuban Revolution. My mother watched it. She lived in Cuba before and after the Cuban Revolution. She watched a culturally Catholic country turn communist in 6 months. And at the time, the belief was it's okay if people died in the process. If they kill your way into power, guess what happened when you got into power? They just killed more people the moment they got confronted. It wasn't, oh, well, we'll kill our way into power and we'll become peaceful once we get there. If you want to be peaceful, you have to get there peacefully. I think somewhere it was written, the road to heaven needs to be heaven.
That is well said. Along those lines, I will say that from a standpoint of leadership, I think there is so much responsibility, whether you are a leader or a manager, that you don't just impact somebody at work. You impact them in every part of their life. And what I mean is that if you treat somebody poorly at work and you've created an environment that lacks that sense of safety, that goes home with them and impacts the relationship they have with their significant other or their kids or their friends, that isn't compartmentalized. it bleeds out into every part of their life. And to your point is, I think we should be measured on that. What difference do we make?
I agree.
In somebody else's life.
I agree.
Thank you so much for this insight. Again, we didn't talk about in influence anything about closes or how to get people to say yes. So much of this is on the foundation of how we behave to create that environment to make that happen.
I think if you do these things, a close and getting a yes is just a formality. Yeah, it's just a formality, because if you can be the right person and you can paint the picture and you can engage people at the right level, they'll be begging to do business with you.
Completely agree. Again, thank you so much. Wishing you all the best.
My pleasure.
In the coming year.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate it.
Peace. If you found my podcast episodes or my perspectives to be beneficial in your own leadership development or to the development of your team, I'd love the opportunity to have a discussion with you about how the approaches that I outline in my book, The Leadership Bridge, how to engage your employees and drive organizational excellence, can help you and your organization to attract, develop, and retain the best talent. If that's of interest to you, I would encourage you to reach out to me at patrick@emeryleadershipgroup.com. And that's EMERY leadershipgroup.com. I hope we have an opportunity to talk and explore how I can help you and your organization rise above your best.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.